want to talk this morning on a passage that you'll find if you've got your Bible with you this is the passage where Jesus calms the storm. And if you've ever heard a talk on this passage, you'll know the essential point is that there are storms in our lives and Jesus calms them. And yes, that is basically where I'm going to go. That's it in a nutshell. But I want to encourage you to try and stay with me anyway, and maybe see if we can discover something new together that God might want to say to us from this passage, because I do think it's an important one. And the reason I'm going to be talking about this, and then Mike is going to go on in the second session and begin to talk a little bit on some of the relationship stuff, is this is to do with our relationship with God. And the starting place really for having any healthy relationship on a horizontal level with any person that we know is to be right before God, because really He's the one that gives us the strength to love the unlovely. And we're told again by John that we love because we're first loved. And what I have found in my own life with God is that there are times when my relationship with Him just sort of, without me almost noticing it, we drift away from one another, God and I. Well, it's not He drifts from me, I drift from Him. I drift inch by inch, degree by degree, without even realizing it. And sometimes something happens that brings me up short, and I realize, oh my word, this intimacy, Lord, which I thought we were enjoying, I now see that it's kind of like the sky's clouded over and it's blotted out the sun, and I hadn't even picked up that was happening. And one of the things that often causes me to think, do you know what, this isn't all it could be, are when I meet those Christians, and you'll probably know one, you're probably here with one, who they're just irritatingly at peace with things. And they seem to have a joy about them. You know, I meet people all the time, and it's like, man, you have like a much, if you like, heavier burden to carry than I do. You got a lot more on your plate. Maybe you've been through a lot more than I have. And yet you seem to have this joy and this inner sense of delight in God, this peace that I don't have it. And I want that. And how do you get that? And I remember in a talk I heard John Centimore, the Archbishop of York, speak once. And someone asked him a question about belief. And he just stood up and he said, for me, belief is risk. And then he said, but I'm a prisoner of hope. And I'm a captive of a God who stopped me in my tracks, embraced me, and kissed me. And I just thought, wow. And when he said it, it sounded really cool. And I thought, how do you get that? How do you become a captive of hope, a captive of peace? And one of the things that we've got to grow in understanding is that the way in which our culture works is something like peace. And being really at peace is not something that comes naturally to us. And ironically, in the West, we now have more stuff than we've ever had before. And we have products for pretty much everything. So we have all these products to keep us going, which half of you are drinking right now. Caffeine, or we have, Red Bull to give us wings for the work project we've got to do, or whatever it is. And then we have at the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, all these products to slow us down. So we have aromatherapy candles and Radox bubble bath and all this stuff just to help us chill out. We have these things to keep us going and drive us, and these things at the other end to slow us down and stop us. And we have stuff for pretty much everything. Life has become unbelievably convenient. So we can do all sorts of stuff, not just with the iPhone, but with on the internet. Pretty much everything is instant. And although we've managed to achieve so many things, one of the things that still in our society is so obvious we haven't found is this thing of peace. And we're afraid of all sorts of things. And one of the things that I like to do in my spare time is watch documentaries, which these days basically seem to be find some weird people and film them. And I was reading a little while ago, there's this ITV1 documentary that came out. And there was this article about it in the Telegraph. And it says this. It's about people who have phobias, this one. So it says, while spiders and heights are common sources of anxiety, many people's lives are blighted by phobias of seemingly innocuous objects. David Allison, a therapist based at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, was filmed treating some of the worst sufferers in an ITV1 documentary to be shown next week. They include Sue Williams, 37, from Dudley in the West Midlands, who is so terrified of knees that she has not touched her own for 16 years. And cannot say kneecap without bursting into tears. And this is quoting Sue. I don't like my own. I can't touch them. She probably doesn't sound like this because she's from Dudley, but whatever. I can't touch them. I certainly can't touch anyone else's, she said. I know it's strange. People tease me about it, and they have every right to. But I think I'm the normal one, and everyone else is weird. Sure, Sue. Until her therapy sessions, Mrs. Williams was unable to wash her knees in the bath and could not look at her husband's knees. Mr. Allison's treatment involved showing her photographs of knees, which reduced her to sobs. In the final session, he wore a pair of shorts and encouraged her to look at his kneecaps until the feelings of terror subsided. So that's Sue. There are some other people in this documentary. So one is a lady called Louise Arnold from Gloucester, who has a phobia of peas. And by that, I mean little green peas. Which means she cannot walk down the frozen food aisle of a supermarket. Explaining her dislike of peas, she said, "They tend to just look at me, ganging up on me. All the hairs on the back of my neck go up, and I don't know where I can't go into a supermarket until I know where they are. It's just controlling my life now." There's a guy called Kim Crosby from Cambridge who is terrified of barns, like the big wooden barns. And they say, "It's very hampering in the summertime because I would like to drive around with the roof of my car down, but then there's nothing to protect me." So, there you go. And those are kind of obviously stupid things, but actually when you start to look at some of the stuff that's going on under the surface, the currents in society around us, there's some much more serious things that are happening, and these are a few statistics. And I know statistics we all glaze over, but these are people. So just consider some of this stuff. Self-harm statistics for the UK show that we have one of the highest rates of self-harm in Europe, at 400 per 100,000 of the population. Between 1 in 12 and 1 in 15 children and young people deliberately self-harm. According to a survey in 2013 by the Office of National Statistics, nearly 1 in 5 adults in the UK experience anxiety and depression. The World Health Organization puts the figure at 15% of the population of a developed country. And depression affects the elderly, 1 in 5 older people living in the community, and 2 in 5 older people who live in care homes struggle with depression. Nearly 80,000 children and young people suffer from depression, and over 8,000 of those are children under the age of 10. Suicide is still the most common cause of death in men under the age of 35. And the statistics vary year on year, but it's about 5,500 people kill themselves every year in the UK. And around 420,000 individuals in Britain believed that they were experiencing work-related stress at a level that was making them ill. An estimated 1 in 100 women between the ages of 15 and 30 has anorexia. 1 million people in the UK have been diagnosed with an eating disorder, and that includes girls as young as 7. And this is our culture. This is the UK. It's where we live. And of course, it's not all doom and gloom. You know, there's lots of goodness and kindness and gentleness and compassion and dignity and humanity around us. But also at the same time, we can't fail to notice that many people are crippled by things like addiction. We see people at the top of their game often, and tragically, actors and politicians who end up committing suicide for one reason or another. They pop up on the news reasonably regularly. And what is going on? One of the things that is going on, surely it has to be that there's a lack of peace, that we still haven't found it for all the things we may have achieved and all the prosperity we might have surrounding us. We still haven't found this thing of peace. And that is why this story from Mark chapter 4 matters. So why not I read it? We can read it together. So Mark 4, verse 35 says this. That day, when evening came, he said, that's Jesus, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There also were other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." And I was driving to Cambridge. It was about a month ago now. I was driving to Cambridge. It was when we were having some of those. It was when the floods were all going on, and there were storms and stuff like that. And I remember driving because I ended up driving through a storm. and I was by myself in the car, and I was driving along, and then these really sort of purple, heavy, angry clouds started floating around above me, and the rain started to pound the car, and I was driving on a motorway, and everyone on the motorway started to slow down, so we were going like 50 miles an hour on the motorway, and then there was a thunder and lightning storm, and I remember it was mental because it felt like it was literally just happening straight above me, to the point where as I was driving, there'd be a flash of lightning and then a thunder, and then I'd go, whoa, even though I was in the car by myself. Every time it was happening, I was like, whoa, and I was trying to keep the car on the road, and I remember there was a tree that had fallen on the outside lane and the inside lane, the motorway, and so everyone was sort of slowing down and swerving to avoid that, and I remember thinking, this is absolutely mental, and I'm there in a storm, in a car, nice and warm and dry. So let's just flash back 2,000 years ago, when these disciples are out there on a lake in the open Sea of Galilee with these waves that are just pounding them, and obviously the wind was howling around, and they got this tiny little boat that's being rocked backwards and forwards like it's a little toy. And these guys, half the disciples were fishermen, so they were experts on Lake Galilee. They got most things wrong, but they did know how to sail a boat on Lake Galilee. And these guys start to panic. And often when things are serious, it's the experts who panic first, because they're the ones that really know what's going on. They're the ones that really understand it. And these professional fishermen at that point start to think, oh my word, we are going to die. And then you see the contrast. There is Jesus at the back of the boat, asleep on a cushion. And you can imagine, let's say you are driving a car, and you're driving down like one of these mountain passes or something like that. And it's snowy and it's icy and there's some sort of snowstorm. You're there with your mate and there's no barrier, and it's one of those songs with a really steep drop. And if in that situation, I think probably all of us would be pretty terrified. And so we'd be there fighting to keep the car on the road, trying to make sure that it doesn't skid off. And all the things that happen when we're afraid would start to happen. So your palms would be sweaty and your mouth would be dry and your eyes, pupils would be dilated. You probably need the toilet. And you're there and you're fighting to keep it on. And then you just glance over and your mate is just, with their head against the window, just sleeping. How would you react in that situation? We would all do exactly the same thing. We'd be like, what the heck are you doing? Wake up. At least panic with me. At least join in with panicking. Even if you're not driving, don't just sleep. And so that's what the disciples do. As they're fighting to keep themselves alive, that's literally what they think they're doing. They think they're going to die, and they just can't get out. So they go over to Jesus, and they wake him up. I don't know what they did to wake him up, because waves in the face weren't waking him up. So they somehow, pulled his beard, or they did something, but they woke him, and then they said to him, they say, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Don't you care?" And for us, when we go through life, and we're followers of Jesus, when we go through life, and life becomes hard, and the waves of life get thrown at us, and we face pain and we face suffering, one of the first questions I ask to the Lord is exactly the question that they asked him. I say, "Lord, don't you care? Don't you see what's going on? Don't you care what's happening to me?" And this is the age-old question of suffering, the problem of pain. And Philip Yancey is a Christian author. He's written a lot of great stuff on this, but he writes this. He says, "Why must I keep circling back to the problem of pain? I sometimes wonder. Then, on a book tour, I meet an older man with a full beard who walks to the microphone with a shuffle and mumbles, 'God gave me Parkinson's disease. How can I possibly think that God listens to what I have to say in prayer?' I hear accounts of suicide, birth defects, terminal diseases, and children hit by trucks. A woman confesses praying in desperation during her 19 years of an abusive marriage, 'Lord, if someone is killed by a drunk driver, let it be my husband.' I meet a woman afflicted with multiple sclerosis, shockingly young, who limps over to tell me she is learning all she can about prayer because the disease is progressing so quickly that soon she will be capable of little else. I speak on the topic of grace, and a woman approached the book table to tell me she needs to work on forgiveness. 'Don't we all?' I say. 'No, really, I need to,' she replies, and proceeds to tell me that her father murdered her husband. First he stole my past by abusing me. Now he has stolen my future. Yet she doesn't want the children to grow up hating their grandfather who is serving time in prison. The man behind her waits patiently as we talk and then tells me of his daughter's rape in the parking garage of Phoenix Airport. She decided to keep the child, a daughter, he says. She named her Grace." And this is something that all of us, if we're not facing it now, we will. at some point in life. And the reality is answers are not always given. The answer to why this is happening often remains something of a mystery, often remains clouded. But Lee Strobel, when he's talking about this, one of the things that he says is a little bit like as Christians. You know when you're driving your car at night and it's really foggy and it's a dark night and you can't see the road very clearly, and then a lorry comes and overtakes you. Actually, that's quite a good thing at times, because what that means is you can just tuck in there behind the lorry and you follow the tail lights of the lorry, and that's enough to get you to where you need to go. And what he says is often the whole view is not made clear, but we can see in the scriptures some tail lights, some things that we can follow, that we can hold on to, that are enough to get us there. And one of those tail lights in this story is Jesus is asleep in the boat. The point I want to emphasize is that he's asleep in the boat. He's there in the boat, and he doesn't need to be. Think of it like you decide to go on a really dangerous adventure. You just think, I'm going to go and do something crazy. And you want to go and climb Everest or something. And you tell one of your best friends this, and they're very concerned about you because you're not very fit. And so they decide, okay, well, I'm just going to have to come with you. I don't really want to go on this journey, but you're going on this journey, so I'm going to have to come with you. So you go with them, and you start climbing Everest with them, and halfway up, you make a base camp, and there's a snowstorm, and they're fast asleep in the tent, and you're just fighting this storm to keep the tent awake. If in that point you turn to them and you slap them and you say, hey, wake up, don't you care that we're going to die? Don't you care about me? What have you missed? We've missed the fact that they're in the tent in the first place, the fact that they chose to come on the journey with you in the first place, shows in a way greater than shoveling snow ever could that they care about you. They've chosen to come with you. And I don't want this in any way to sound twee, because pain is pain and suffering is real and it is confusing, and there are no cliched answers that will ever satisfy any of us, quite rightly so. At the same time, the clearest message the Lord Jesus gives us, that he cares about our pain and he understands our suffering, is that he chose to come and be with us. What sort of faith has a cross, the Roman symbol of torture, at its heart? Celebrates that, a faith that takes pain and suffering very, very seriously. What we can do sometimes in the midst of a storm is judge God by his latest miracle, by whether he's performed one. And we forget the fact that he's come to be with us in the midst of the storm. And that is the sign of his care. So they slap, I don't know if they slapped Jesus. I hope they didn't, because he was pretty annoyed anyway. So they wake him and they say, don't you care? And Jesus doesn't actually give them the answer that I just gave. Do you know what he says? He asks a question of his own to them. He says, why are you afraid? He turns to his disciples and says, why are you afraid? And you can imagine the scene there. When they wake him, the waves are throwing this boat around. They're getting swamped. And Jesus stands up and he just turns to the waves and he says, be still. So they go from getting tossed around like a little rag doll to suddenly the waves just stop. And it's like a mill pond just lapping the boat. The wind, which is howling around, so they would have had to be shouting at each other. He just says, stop, and the wind just dies. And then in that new stillness, he turns to them and he says, hey, why are you afraid? Well, I'm afraid, Lord, because I think I'm going to get rejected yet again. I'm afraid, Lord, because I just lost my job and I don't know if I'm going to be able to find another one. I'm afraid, Lord, because I'm trying to discover my calling, but I don't really feel like I'm there yet, and I think I'm going to miss it. I'm afraid, Lord, because I think you see everyone else in this room and you don't see me. I'm afraid, Lord, because in my head I can't understand you. And if I can't understand you, I don't know if I can follow you. And I'm afraid that I might have to stop this. I'm afraid that this is going to be too hard. I'm afraid, Lord, for my family, because one of them's going through a difficult time. I'm afraid, Lord, for my friends. It doesn't really feel like they know me. And if they did, would they stay? I'm afraid, Lord, for the future. What's going to happen? I've got so many questions. There's so much that's uncertain. I'm afraid, Lord, and I don't know why I'm afraid. I just have this fear all the time, and it just cripples me. It seems to stop me living life. I'm afraid, Lord, because the waves are just too big, and the wind is just too powerful, and my boat is just too small. I'm afraid, Lord, because I think I'm going to drown, and you don't seem to be anywhere. Why are you afraid? And then do you know what he says? He says, don't you trust me? And when we look at what Jesus does here, of course, what he does is he creates calm instantly all around them. But in the reality of our lives, and I'm sure for you it's the same, what I've found is often he doesn't do that. He doesn't click his fingers and the difficult circumstances just disappear like magic. That's rarely what he does. But he does bring a different sort of peace. And what we need to be clear on as Christians is that the Lord doesn't call us to an easy life. He doesn't promise that there's never going to be pain. In fact, he tells us the opposite. He tells us straight. So in John chapter 16, verse 33, he says to his disciples, in this world you will have trouble. In this world, you are going to have trouble. And actually, most of the disciples in the boat ended up being martyrs for him. So he doesn't promise them this easy life. At the same time, what he does do is he does create a peace in the midst of the storm. That is not a get-out clause for God. That's just the reality of what he promises us. And during World War II, there was a painting competition. The painting competition was to paint a peaceful landscape. I think in the midst of the war, they thought that would be nice. And so all these people entered paintings into the competition, and the painting that came second was kind of like the Lake District, and it was this classic sort of English countryside with little sheep everywhere, and it was a very nice, peaceful landscape. The painting that ended up winning was actually a painting of a waterfall just after all the snow had melted. And it was quite a dark scene, and the waterfall was rushing really, really powerfully, and it was all kind of mental. And initially, when you looked at it, you just thought, well, this has nothing to do with peace. But then if you looked carefully, what you could see is behind a rocky outcrop, just next to the waterfall, there was this bird's nest sheltered by this rock. And there was a mother bird with her chicks that had just hatched, and she was sheltering them, and they were sheltered by this outcrop. That was the picture of peace that won. And that is the picture of peace that God offers to us. And the way that we receive that is that we come back again. And I know it's hard, but we come back again to choosing to trust him. The disciples say to Jesus, don't you care? Do you know what he says back? He says, don't you trust me? And if you're at work or something like that and you give someone a job, I don't know if any of you have to delegate, but like when we delegate a task, let me ask you a question. When you delegate that task, do you then stop worrying about it? Depends who you've given it to, doesn't it? Absolutely depends on who you've given it to. So there are some people there you think, do you know what, if I give you this job, it is definitely going to get done. It's as good as done. I can put it out of my mind now. I can be at peace. There are other people you give the job to, and it's like, you know that in about 5 minutes you're going to have to tell them again. Then you're going to have to send them an email. Then you're going to have to send them a text. Then you're probably going to do it yourself eventually anyway because they've forgotten it or they wouldn't have done it to your standards, which of course are best. And so it's like we don't really, we never really let it go until we completely trust the person that we've delegated it to. Sometimes what I do is I do exactly that with God. Lord, I'll give you my trouble, but then I'm not entirely sure that I can delegate to you, God. So I'm just going to have to take that one back and carry on stressing about it for a little while longer. And you're probably not going to do it to my standards, so maybe I should just keep trying to work on this. And what we're told is in the Psalms, there's this verse. Ironically, Jesus is there asleep in the boat, but in the Psalms we're told of God, he will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. So many times we're told that God watches over us, that he guards over us, that while we sleep, he is always awake, watching over us. Can you imagine if, because I was worried about my property here at Center Parks, I hired a guard to stand outside with a shotgun to get the squirrels and anyone else that was coming near me? And I'm there, and I've got this guard. I've paid a lot of money to employ this guard. And then the guard's there, and then I'm standing up, awake, watching out of the window just to make sure there was no one else. If I did that, what would be the point of the guard? If I didn't trust him to watch, what would be the point of employing him? Now, we daren't ever talk about employing God, but if we don't trust him to watch over us, why give him the trouble and then take it back again? Don't you trust me? Jesus says to them. And part of the key of trusting him is, again, it's to come back to, well, who are you? Who are you? And what does trust to God lead to? What it leads to, it can sound like this sort of abstract thing of having peace and having trust. Do you know what it leads to? It leads to joy, real joy. When was the last time you just laughed from the belly? It leads to actual relaxation, to just kick back and relax and let the weight that's been sitting there for so long, you've forgotten that it's actually there, lift. It leads to going to sleep. Not spiritually, just actually sleeping well. Like Jesus is there, out for the count in the boat because he trusts the Father. When was the last time you just slept deeply because your cares had been given over to him? One of the things that I try and do, I don't do it as much as I would like, but often I find that before I go to bed, I'll try and read a little bit of the Psalms because I can usually find one to suit my mood. And if I find, I've learned from experience, if I go to bed having read Twitter, I have nightmares. And so one of my favorite Psalms to read just before I go to sleep is Psalm 4. And the reason I love it is because there's verse 8 in there, and it says, "In peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety." Paul talks about it in another way in Philippians chapter 4, verse 6, it's verse 7 even. He says, "The peace of God, which transcends all understanding," which means it's beyond the circumstances, beyond rationality, it arrives in your heart. He says, "will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." Jesus says, "Don't you trust me?" And then do you know what? There's this little question exchange. "Lord, don't you care? Why are you afraid? Don't you trust me?" And then they see what he's done. And the final question that they ask themselves is, who is this guy? Who is this guy? We thought he was just the carpenter's son. And he's got the authority to calm a storm. The reason he's worthy of our trust is because he's stronger than the storm. They grow more afraid after the storm stops because they see who Jesus is. They see how strong he is. And the other thing, the final thing to say, as we draw into a close with this, is it's like he is the only one that can give us true peace. "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and you will find rest for your souls." And the sort of peace that we're talking about here when we talk about the peace that Jesus brings is it's not a peace that's an absence of stress. Like an absence of like, oh, I don't have a big project on this week. It's not that sort of peace. It's a wholeness. The word is shalom. It's like a heavy wholeness of presence. And it's a little bit like the difference between waking up at home and waking up at Center Parcs. And when I wake up at home, if I wake up early enough, it's kind of quiet, but there's the traffic there and there's a baby next door crying and there's, people honking their horns in the street and it's sort of a bit quiet, but it's not that quiet. And then you wake up at Center Parcs if you wake up early enough, which, by the way, none of you did this morning because, as I said at the start, it was empty at 9:30, but whatever. Let's say you managed to wake up at a crazy time like 9:15. And you wake up then, and it's like, what I imagine here is it's the quiet, it's the silence. And the difference between quiet and silence is a real one. Silence is almost like the heavy presence of something. Do you know the peace that God brings? It's not an absence of stress. It's a heavy sense of wholeness. He's the only one that can give that. And C.S. Lewis, he captures this in one of his Narnia books, the one that's called The Silver Chair. And Jill arrives in Narnia for the first time, and she's very thirsty. And she's looking around for somewhere to get a drink. But also she sees this lion flitting to and fro. And the lion is Aslan, and he obviously represents God, but she doesn't realize that. And so eventually she comes to this stream. But just on her side of the stream is the lion, and he's lying there. And the lion says to her, "If you're thirsty, you may drink." But Jill is afraid, and she says, "Will you promise not to do anything to me if I come?" she asks. The lion replies, "I make no promises." Jill was so thirsty now that without noticing it, she had come a step nearer. "Do you eat girls?" she said. "I have swallowed up girls and boys, women and men, kings and emperors, cities and realms," said the lion. It didn't say this as if it were boasting, nor as if it were sorry, nor as if it were angry. It just said it. "I daren't come and drink," said Jill. "Then you will die of thirst," said the lion. "Oh dear," said Jill. It's not a good thing to do in Narnia either. "Oh dear," said Jill, coming another step nearer. "I suppose I must go and look for another stream then." "There is no other stream," said the lion. "There is nowhere else that we will find peace." Why do you think everyone in the UK is still looking for it? There is nowhere else we will find it. We find it in him because he is stronger than the storm. He doesn't fit in our pockets. But we also find it in him because he's so willing to give it. And I just want to finish with one final story. Just before Christmas, I was due to speak at the Oxford University Carol service, and I hadn't had a lot of time to prepare. And I remember realizing on Sunday that I was speaking on Monday night, and suddenly thinking, oh no. And I was feeling very afraid of going there, because I was like, it's Oxford, they all love being clever, and I'm going to be really intimidated by it. And I was speaking in what they call the Sheldonian Theatre, which is this really grand building right at the heart of Oxford. And I was thinking, oh my God, this is going to be awful. And I remember just before I went to bed, I was doing my thing of just reading a psalm before I went to bed. And I really felt like the Lord just said, oh, go to Psalm 71. It just came into my head. So I turned to Psalm 71. And I found a lot of comfort in Psalm 71, because it's all about this guy that's really trying his best to declare the praises of God to the next generation, but doesn't feel like he can find the words. And I thought, oh, that's great. That's exactly where I'm at. And then the whole of Monday, I desperately was trying to write this talk for the evening carol service, and it just wasn't happening. When you try and be creative, when you're like, I must be creative today, nothing happens. And I was trying to be creative, I was trying to come up with something, and I couldn't come up with anything. And what I was doing is every half hour, 45 minutes, I went back to Psalm 71 just to cheer myself up a little bit, and then I would carry on writing the talk. And it got to the point where I had to leave, and Mike and Beth actually came with me because I was so stressed out. They came for moral support. But I had to leave, and as we were driving there in the car, I wouldn't let them speak. I had to sit there in silence while I stressed, and while I tried to write a talk, and Mike tried to cheer me up. He said, oh mate, what have you got? And I had like 2 ideas, and he was like, oh. And at that point I thought, oh my word, I'm really in trouble now. And I remember we arrived an hour and a half early to Oxford, and so I went to the Sheldonian Theatre, and I went and sat in a toilet cubicle with the door locked in the basement of the Sheldonian Theatre, thinking, oh my word, I'm about to speak in about half an hour to hundreds and hundreds of these non-Christian students. That all there's an expectation there, and I haven't got anything to say. And I texted my dad, and I just said, oh, hey, Dad, because he went to university. I texted him and just said, I'm about to speak in the place that he did a graduation ceremony in. I don't normally text him, but I was just like, would you mind praying for me, because I'm a little bit nervous, which was the understatement of the century. And he said, sure, I'll pray for you. And then he texted me a picture, which he's never done before. And he texted me this picture, and he said, Andy, I just had a picture of the Holy Spirit just filling you and fear leaving. And at that moment, I'll be totally honest with you, it was like, great. Because it's like the Holy Spirit isn't even in Oxford, let alone this toilet cubicle. At least that's how it feels. That's how it feels. And so I was there screaming, desperately trying to write this thing. And then every 15 minutes in that toilet cubicle, I read Psalm 71 aloud to myself to be like, come on, you can do it, come on. And anyway, eventually, I had to give the talk. So I went upstairs, and I had these scribbled notes on a piece of paper that really weren't anything. And I got up, and I gave the talk, and in the end, I don't know how it happened, but in the end, it actually went all right. And maybe if you were talking to the Oxford students, they might not agree with that, but in comparison to what it could have been, it was a flipping miracle, I'll tell you. And it actually went all right. And I remember thinking, as I was going home, because you know what I've been thinking on the way there? Honestly, one of the thoughts that came into my head when I was sitting in silence in the car stressing is, I could pray about this, but what's that going to do? That's what I thought. Genuinely, that's what I thought. And I look back now, and I'm like, what the heck was wrong with me? Well, how could I think that? But I remember driving home and thinking, oh, my word, God, for me, that you came through in that moment. You were so kind to me. Thank you for doing that. And the next morning, I texted my dad, and I said, oh, hey, Dad, it went, just so you know, it went well last night. And he'd been on his way. He works for Church of England. He'd been on his way to the chapel the evening before to pray for me. And he said, and I said, oh, and by the way, you should check out Psalm 71. It's a really good one. And he texted back, and he said, oh, yeah, that is a really good one. It just so happened that was the psalm that we read aloud last night in chapel when we prayed for you by name. And that might not seem like a very big deal, but to me, honestly, the fact that I was sitting in a toilet cubicle in Oxford reading Psalm 71 aloud to myself to cheer myself up. And my dad was up in Sheffield, and he just so happened to have Psalm 71 read aloud, completely coincidentally, and pray for me by name. That was just the Lord just letting me know, hey, Andy, it might have felt like I was fast asleep, but actually, I was holding you right there in the palm of my hand. That's always, always how it works. And the questions to allow the Lord to ask each of us this morning are those two questions Jesus addresses to the disciples. Why are you afraid? And what's stopping you from trusting me?